Let's take a closer look at class-based views. That's what this course section will be about. Because in the last course section, we already got started with class-based views, inheriting from this base view class, which Django gives us to build this class-based view with get and post methods. Now, in this course section, we're going to dig a bit deeper and explore other variants of pre-built views which we can inherit from. We're going to take a look at template views and what those do for us. We're going to take a look at lists and detail views and see what Django has in store when it comes to that and when we would use those views and of course how we use them. And we're going to have a look at views dedicated to fetching user data, like the FormView, but then also the create, update, and delete views. And we're going to see what those views do for us and how we use them. Now, I'm back in this feedback project we worked on in the last course section. Now, I don't want to work on the forms there. Instead, I want to add more templates, and I want to work on that. And for this, I'll therefore start by actually building a base template, and I'll add it here in my Reviews app templates folder. We could also set up a root templates folder in the overall project, as we also did it before in the course. But I'll do it here. And the idea here, of course, is that we have a base HTML skeleton here, and then we do what we did many times before. We create our block for the title here so that the individual templates can inherit from this template and set their own title. And I'll also add a block for the content here. And you could add more blocks and change this structure as needed by you, but I want to keep this simple. Therefore, I will also directly import my styles into this base HTML file, and I'll set up the styles for all my templates in that styles CSS file then. I'll not add template-specific CSS files, though of course you could do this, and as a practice you might want to do this. But to save some time and not spend too much time on this general setup, I'll go with one CSS file only. And therefore here I'll add a link, and here then load my static reviews/styles CSS file like this. And of course for this we need to load static at the top. So now we got this. The idea now simply is that in review HTML, instead of loading static here, I extend my reviews base HTML file, so this base we just worked on, and then we just want to set the title and the content. So I'll remove the rest of this skeleton, and then here we have our title block with that title, and let's also of course end that block therefore like this. And we also set up our content block here, block content, which we of course thereafter also end. And we do the same for thank you. Here I will now also extends my reviews base HTML file, and then define the block for the title where I just say thank you in the title like this. And then we also here set up our content block like this. And I'm doing all of this because now I'll soon add more templates. So here we just say thank you. Okay, with that, if we open the terminal and we again restart our server, if I run our server here again, I still get my form here, and I can still leave my feedback here. Click send, and I'm taken to the thank you page. And the styling, of course, could be improved, but as I said, it's not the focus here. Instead, I now want to add more URLs. For example, I want to have a /reviews URL, which lists all the reviews we got. And I also then want to be able to dive into an individual review to view it. And we can, of course, do all of that by going to our views and adding more views and more view functions and methods there, and applying what we learned throughout the course. And that is something we absolutely could do. But the idea in this course section is to use class-based views for that. And that's therefore what we're going to get started with in the next lecture. Now let's start simple with that thank you template. Currently we're rendering it with this view function. And of course that's a very lean, basic function. There's nothing wrong with that. We can absolutely leave that function as it is. But to dive into more class-based views, which you could use, I want to still convert this to a class-based view. So definitely try this on your own. We're going to do it together after a short pause, which you can use to pause the video. Were you successful? In the end, I just want to create a class and I'll name it ThankYouView. And I'll extend that base view class, which we're importing from Django views. And then we need to set the get method in there. This view doesn't have a post method because no post request will ever reach this view. Instead, we load that view with this URL here, and that will only be loaded once we redirect to that URL after successfully submitting our form here. So that will then always be a GET request, so just setting the GET method here is enough. And then in this GET method, we should return a response. And of course here, we can return our rendered template and then get rid of that ThankYouView function. Now for that, GET gets self and request as arguments automatically by Django, as you learned. And with that, we can go to URLs py and replace views.thankyou like this with views.thankyouView.asView. Just as we did it with the review view. Well, and with that, if we reload this thank you page, that still works. And of course, if I submit this form again, that also still works, and I get this thank you page. Now that's applying what we learned in the last course section. But if you have a view which primarily deals with showing some template, as we're doing it here, then you can absolutely inherit from view, add the get method, and return the rendered template there. But you can also use a different built-in view class Django gives you, a more specific view class specifically geared at this use case of returning a template. For this, we add a new import here, and from Django.views, we dive into generic.base, and from there we import the template view now. And that is also a view you can extend, just like this base view, but it's more specific. And it's specifically focused on allowing you to build view classes that render templates. So now we can use this imported template view and inherit that instead of just view. Now, when doing that, you don't define a get method here anymore. Instead, in that case here, we're focused on returning a template. That's why we use this template view. And therefore, what we gotta do here is set a template name property in this class. And that should then point at your template file, at the template you want to use. So in this case, reviews/thankyou HTML. So what we previously passed to the render method is now set as a template name. And this is not any random property name I came up with. This is an expected property name, as you could tell by the fact that I'm getting auto-completion here and that this is suggested here. Now Django will automatically take this template and return and render that if a GET request reaches this view. Hence, we don't need to change anything else. With that change made, if I reload the thank you URL, I still get that thank you template. And now we have an even leaner view where we don't need to add the get method and where we don't need to call render or anything like that. Instead, we just need to set the template name and Django will automatically return it for get requests that reach this view. Now, of course, you might have a template though, where you want to add some extra context. In this case, we don't have any extra context. Thank you is a static template with no dynamic content. But of course, theoretically, we could be outputting some dynamic content here. We could, for example, be expecting some message which we want to interpolate in our template. And that, of course, brings up the question how we would then pass such context data, such data that could be used in the template to the template when using this template view. For this, there is a specific method which you can add to your view class when it inherits from the template view, like this one does. And that's the getContextData method. And you also see here that I'm getting auto-completion, which proves that this is one of the methods you can override. Now, if I hit tab here, this auto-completes even, which is very convenient. It gives me type annotations. I'll remove those since we haven't used types before here. But then I get this context data method here. Now, the idea here is that in this context data, get context data method, you should return the context that is exposed to the template. So that dictionary of key value pairs, like we're doing it here for this render method up there, which should be exposed to this template. You also always should call super get context data here, but you don't necessarily need to return a result of that. You just should make sure that it gets called so that the super get context data method, so the method defined in the base template view, is executed. So what you can do, for example, is you can get the context from calling that super get context data, which is then already a dictionary, though typically that of course will now be empty. And you can now add new keys to the dictionary. For example, here we can add a message key to this context dictionary because it is a message which I'm expecting in the template. And we can set this to any value we want, like this works. And let me use double quotes here as well, therefore. And then in the end, we want to return this context. And that's how we now construct the context which will be exposed to the template. If we now save everything and reload, we see this works message in the template as well. So that's the more specific template view base class, which allows you to write even less code than with just the view if your goal is to return a template for a GET request. You can then still enrich it with data as you saw, but that is the purpose of this template view. And it's one of the built-in views you can use to make your life easier and to write less code. Now let's use this template view we learned about to output a list of all the reviews we received thus far. And for this, I'll add a new template here, review list.html, and that will extend the reviews base HTML file, of course. And then I want to set a title where I say all reviews. And then in the content, I want to just output a list of all the reviews. So here's my content block and end block. And in there, I want to have an unordered list where we then use the for tag to loop through all the reviews and output the reviews in that list in any format of our choice. Now for that, before we continue working on the template, we need to add a new view. And I'll add it as a class-based view, and I'll name it reviews or reviews list view. Now I'll inherit from the template view, though we could of course also inherit from this base view here and build our own get method here where we then render the template. But since I already know that I want to render a template, I will just do it like this, and I will just go here and set my template name to reviews/review_list.html. And then I'll also add the getContextData method here, remove the types, because now I need to infer some data for my context. I need to get access to all those reviews after all. So I'll get the context from my parent class, from the template view, but then I also want to get all my reviews. Now for this, I'll need the review model. Hence, from .models, I'll import the review model. And then here, I get my reviews by reaching out to review.objects.all. And that's, of course, something you learned in depth in the sections where we worked on models and data and so on. So now I got hold of all my reviews. Now on the context, we want to add a new key. And we can name this key reviews, but that key name is up to you. And set that equal to the reviews we fetched from the database, and then return this context. And now in this review list template, we can loop through all the reviews. So for a review in reviews here, we can go through the reviews and render some content, and also end the for block. Now, if we have a look at our model, we see that a review is made up of the username, the review text, and the rating. And I, let's say, want to output the username and the rating, and make that a clickable link, which then takes us to a detail page. But that'll be step number 2. Step number 1 is to output that list with username and rating. So in the review list HTML file, inside this for loop, we want to output a list item, where we then output the user name with the dot notation here in the template. And then let's say in parentheses thereafter, we output the rating. So here I then have review.rating. That's my idea in the template. That should work. Now we also have the template view set up for this. Therefore, we only need to make sure that this is also loaded for a specific URL. Hence in URLs py, it's time to add a new path here, the reviews path. Of course, the path you want to use is up to you. And there, I want to use my review list view as view, just as we did it for the other class-based views here. With all of that, if we save all files and we enter /reviews, I load this list of reviews here, which is coming from my database and which I now load with help of this template view. Now, this is generally applying what we learned about, just with the extra twist that we now use the template view we learned about in the last lecture. Now, let's also build a detail page where we see a single review and where we then also have the review text. Now, definitely try this on your own first, using such a template view. We're going to do that together in the next lecture. So, were you successful? Let's build this together, and let's build our own detail view. For this, I'll add a new template, and I'll name it single_review.html. Obviously, this name is up to you, as always. And we start by extending the reviews base HTML file here. Then we can, of course, again set a title, which could be review detail, and then end block. And we need our content block here. And my idea for this content block is that in there, I want to output the username, below that the review text, or actually below that, I want to output the rating, and then below that, I want to output the review text. So a very simple template without any special styling. You could, of course, make this more fancy, as mentioned before already. But this is now my template, which I want to use. Now we need to add a view for this. So let's add a new view class here. The single review view could be the name for this class. And we also inherit from TemplateView there. Now we add template name property to point at reviews single underscore review HTML. And then we need our context data like this to make sure that we load that data for that single review, so that we load that single review and we set the proper context. Now for this, let's maybe start with the URLs py. Here we need to add a new path. And my idea is that this is now reviews slash, and then here the ID of that review. That will be a number, so we can also add the int path transformer in front of it to convert this to a number. So we have this dynamic path segment now, and then for that URL, it's that single review view, which should be loaded as a view, like this. Now that's the URL, and this dynamic segment here will of course be important. In our views.py file, we now want to load that single review. Now getContextData gets these keyword arguments, and that will be the collected dynamic segments we might have gotten for loading this view. So through keyword arguments, we can get access to the dynamic segments encoded in our URLs. So our review ID can be retrieved from Quarks for the key ID, written like this, because I used ID as an identifier here. If you use the different identifier here in your URL, you also need to access it differently on your Quarks. And Quarks are a default Python concept, nothing specific to Django. Now with that review ID, we have our selected review, which we get by using the review model.objects get, and then we can look for the review where the primary key, which is that ID field, is equal to the review ID we got here. That then is that review which we want to pass to the template, and therefore we can set the review key on the context to that selected review, so that this context contains that review, and that context is of course the context being passed to this single review template file. So in here we can then output review.username to output the username of the user who created the review here. Then output the rating here with review.rating. And then of course, here I want to output the text. So that is review dot, and I named this review text. So dot review text here. Now with that, if we save all of this, if we go to reviews/1, I get an error. Block tag takes only one argument. Yeah, this should be end block here. Let's save this and reload, and that looks better. Now we got this review with ID of 1. If I load the other rating with ID 2, I have a totally different output. So this works now also with a class-based view based on the template view. Now let's dig a bit deeper and let's have a look at even more specific view classes. Now we added more class-based views based on the template view. To be precise, the view for outputting our list of reviews and our single review. Now it turns out that these two use cases are so common, outputting a list of data, no matter if that's a list of blog posts or a list of products or whatever in a template, and outputting a single piece of data in a template. That's so common that Django has specific view classes for these scenarios to make that even easier for you and to help you write even less code. Now let's start with that review list view class. Whenever we have a scenario like this, that we have a template where we want to output a list of data, it will always look something like this. We define the template which we want to render, and then we add getContextData where we fetch all our items. In this case, through the review model, objects all. Now the model might differ, but the operation is pretty much always the same. We then set that data on the context and return the context. Therefore, since this is so common and often the same, Django has another specific view which you can import. And we import this from django.views.generic. So not generic.base, but just generic. From there, we can import the list view. Now, this list view is a more specialized template view, if you want to call it like this. It's still all about rendering a template for a GET request, but it's then also specifically for fetching a list of data based on some model. So exactly what we're doing down there. So now we can change the reviews list view and not inherit from template view, but instead from list view. Once you do that, you can get rid of getContext data, and instead you should add a model property to this class, and that's new. Because now Django will fetch that data for you, but to do that it needs to know for which model it should fetch the data. So here, therefore, I set the model property and I set this to review, pointing at my review class, not instantiating the class, just pointing at it. Now, if we write def get here, we see that there are still a lot of methods we can override though. We can still override context data if we need to pass additional context to the template. We can override get ordering to control how the fetched data should be ordered. We can override get query set, which allows us to change how the data is fetched. So for example, if you want to get a filtered list or anything like this. We can add pagination with these extra methods. So we still can add methods here to get more controls. But if we want to get all the data, we have to do none of that. Instead, we just point at the model, we set up our template name, and we're good. And by default, Django will fetch all the data related to that model and pass it as context to this template. Now, if I save that and I try to go to /reviews, this will fail though. I get an empty page. And the reason for this is that Django will fetch me all those reviews, but it will expose them in my template not named as reviews, but as object list. So if I use object list here instead of reviews, I can keep review here, but this has to be object list. If I do that and reload reviews, it works again. Now, of course, maybe we don't want to use object list though, because that's very unspecific. Reviews definitely was better. And you can do that because as basically all those built-in features Django offers to you, you can configure how this list view works. You can add a context object name property, which allows you to define the name of the data which it will have when it's exposed to your template. So if I set this to reviews here, I can use that fetched list of data under the name reviews in my template. So now I can have reviews in the template because of this extra property which is set here. If I now reload, it still works. And just to come back to these methods which you can override, if you, for example, want to only render the reviews with a rating greater than 4, so only the reviews with a rating of 5, then you can override this getQuerySet method here. This should return a query set. And what we can do here is we can get our base query, or however you want to name it, by calling super getQuerySet. And then on that query, you can call all those query methods you learned about earlier in the course, like filter. Because you learned that you can chain queries after each other. You can chain those query set methods after each other. And the full query will only be executed once the data is really used then. So here we could then filter and filter for rating being greater than 4. And you learned about this syntax earlier in the course. Now we can store this in a new variable and return that variable in getQuerySet. And now if we save this and reload, we have our filtered list here. So you still have full control over how data is fetched, but you don't need to write all the boilerplate around that. You can really focus on defining the template, the model, maybe adjust the querying logic if you need to, and you're good. You don't need to add a get method where you then write every step on your own. Instead, you can use the list view to do a lot of that for you. And if you don't need to narrow down the query, you can even omit that, of course, and you have an even leaner view. And in this case, that is what I want, because I want to show all ratings here. Now, just as we have the list view for fetching a list of data, we also have a detail view for simplifying views like this. Whenever you, in the end, have the goal of returning a template for a GET request with data about a single piece of data, using the detail view instead of a template view with your own logic for fetching that data could be worth a closer look. Now, how do we use the detail view? It starts with importing it, and we also import it from Django views generic. There we can import the detail view. Once imported, we inherit from it. So here for the single review view, I now inherit from the detail view. Now that detail view needs to know for which model it should fetch a single instance. So we should set the model property just as we did it on the list view. And of course here also set it to review. We also set the template name to let the view know which template to render. Now we don't need to set getContext data anymore, though we could if we would have extra context that should be passed in. But for fetching a single piece of data based on that model, we don't need to add this, so I can get rid of it here. Because Django will automatically load a single piece of data. So now the question just is, how does Django identify a single item? And the answer is, it uses a slug or the primary key. And what it should use is defined by you in your URLs. Now here we have that ID identifier, which we used for finding an element by ID. Now what we have to do here for the detail view to work is we need to change this from ID to PK. This tells Django that the value which is about to be entered here should be treated as a primary key value by which Django should find a single piece of data. So if I use int pk here, Django will go to my database and find an entry with the value that was entered here as a primary key. And it will use whichever model field is set up as a primary key field. And by default, that's the automatically added ID field, which every model has. With this added, if we save everything, we now have a way of telling Django how to identify a single object. We have our single review view in place. And therefore now if you load, let's say review/1, we load the page for this single item. Now what's interesting is that this works out of the box, even though in our template for the single review, I'm using review here. So here, Django automatically took the model name, basically, all lowercase, and exposes the fetched single piece of data through that model name to our template. Alternatively, we could use object. That's another key which we can use to access the exposed data in our template. So if I use object and reload, this still shows up correctly. But the model name, all lowercase, also works just fine, as you can tell. And therefore, if you have a scenario like this, where you want to fetch a single piece of data based on some model, using the detail view could also be a nice idea to save some extra code. So by now, there is a chance that things are confusing. Now we learned about this basic view, about the template view, the list view, the detail view, and of course, you could also still write your views as plain functions, so not as classes at all. And therefore the question is, which approach is best? Which approach should you use? The idea of all those specialized view classes is really just to give you the option of writing less code. You don't have to use those classes. If you find them confusing, if you want to be more explicit, if you want to build your views from the ground up and write all the code on your own, you don't need to use ListView or DetailView or anything like that. It really comes down to personal preference if you want to use these highly specialized views when you have a chance for that, when you can. So for example, when you need a list of data, or if you do want to write all the logic on your own. Of course, it also always depends on your scenario and your use case. If you have something like the thank you page where you need no data from a database, then of course you can't use the list view or the detail view for that because you're not fetching any database data at all. So in that case, a template view might be better. If you want to support both get and post methods, and you want to then write the code that should execute for those different methods very explicitly, using that very basic view and inheriting from that might be worth a thought, because there you have full control over that. So it comes down to personal preference, and I'm just showing you these options so that you are aware of them and so that you can pick the best tool for you for the specific use case you might have. But I still got more specific views or specialized views which I want to show you, because up until now, all those more specialized views here were about getting data and rendering a template. Now, what if you actually have a form and data is being submitted, as we have it here in our review view? Maybe we got more specialized views there as well. Now we do have views which are specialized on form handling, because it turns out that scenarios where you have a form or where a form is involved always work in kind of the same way. You need to support GET requests to display the form, and you need to support POST requests to then also handle the form submission, validate it, possibly display the form again with form errors, so with validation errors, or to save some data. And because that flow is basically always the same, instead of using this generic view and adding your own get and post methods, there is another specific view you can use. From Django views generic.edit, you can import the form view. And this is a view which is focused on helping you build class-based views that deal with forms. So here, this review form could now inherit from FormView instead of just view. And now we change the logic in there. Now we need to add a couple of properties. Most importantly, the form class property, which lets Django know which form class should be used for rendering the form, for providing the form to the template, and for validating the input data. And in my case, that's the review form, which is being imported from the forms file. We also want to let Django know what our template file is, so which template should be used for rendering the form. Because of course we still have full control over that. We do that with the template name property, which we already know from below. And here it's then reviews/review.html. So this template which we manually rendered before. Now with this information alone, Django is already able to completely replace our get method we had before. Because there we just needed the form to instantiate it and needed the template to render it with that form. And that's simply taken care of by Django now. Now what about form submission though? Django automatically handles this. For that, let's remove or comment out our post method so that this is our entire review view. Quite a bit shorter than it was before, isn't it? Let's now save this and go back to just localhost 8000. Now, as you see, loading the form still works. So that proves that this view is doing its job and it's correctly creating that form and rendering this template. Now let's try to submit this in an invalid way. For this, I'm opening up my DevTools and I'm removing that required tag from this input so that I work my way around that browser validation and I can submit this in an empty state. Otherwise, the browser would block me from doing that. Then I enter some values here and click send. And we automatically get back the form in this invalid state. So just as before again, this all works just as before. We just don't have to write this extra check to validate and manually return back the populated form as we did before. Instead, Django now takes care about this for us. But what if we fill in correct data and I click send? Then it crashes. And it crashes because we need to provide a success URL. We need to let Django know where it should redirect to when the form is submitted successfully, so with valid data. And we do provide that as an extra property. We simply add success URL, and we then simply define the URL we want to redirect to, like thank you, what I did manually here before. With that success URL added, if we try this again and I submit this valid data again, I'm redirected. But there is something interesting happening. If we go to all our reviews now, you see that review which I just added, where I named the user test, is missing here. Now it is missing because out of the box, this FormView doesn't know what to do with the submitted data. How would it? It could be anything. Maybe we want to write it to a file, maybe we want to send an email, maybe we want to print it to the console, maybe we want to write it to the database. That's why we need to add an extra method here, the FormValid method. This method will be executed by Django when a valid form is submitted. Now we should return super FormValid here to let the parent class do its thing. For example, redirect us. That's one of the things Django's parent class, this FormView class, will do. But before we return here, we can run our own logic. And you see that we get the form, which Django validated and created for us, is received as a parameter. Now in this method, we only receive it if it was valid, because this method is named FormValid. So here we can safely call save then, since we're working with a model form here, just as we did it down there in our custom post code, to save that form, and therefore, as you learned, in case of a model form, to save data to the database. And with this little adjustment made, if we now save this, if I go back to that form and I submit it again, I'm back on thank you, but now if we visit /reviews, we see that data here as well. So now that was created, that was added here as well. And that's therefore the form view, which allows us to, again, reduce our code. We don't have to write our own get and post methods. Instead, that is all it takes to create a view which renders a form, validates a form, and then saves a form. Now we can get even more specific than with the form view, because we still have such a common scenario here that we want to present a form and then save data in a database based on that form. Because that's such a common scenario, we don't even need this form view. There are even more specialized views we can utilize. For this, from Django Views generic edit, instead of the form view, we can import the CreateView. And that's a more specialized form view which will automatically save data for us. It will automatically create data, hence the name. So we can now inherit from CreateView here, and now we don't even need to specify the form class here. We don't even need to create a form class at all. We could delete the form class defined here in forms.py. Instead here, we set up the model again, just as we did it in the list and detail views. Because, of course, since this view is all about creating data, it needs to know for which model to create data. So in this case, the review model. Now this CreateView is able to automatically infer a model form based on that model for you. So you don't even need to create your own review form based on the model form here if you use the CreateView. Instead, you then just need to add fields here, just as we needed to add fields when creating our own form based on model form, to define for which fields of our model we want to create form controls. So we can set this up as we did in our custom form. Alternatively, you still can set up a form class and point at your custom created form, which then should be a model form though. That is something you might want to do if you want to do more than just configure the fields. For example, in our case, we also configure labels and error messages. And that's not possible here in CreateView. You can't add a labels key here. That's not supported. So therefore, here in my case, I will let the CreateView know which model this is all about and which form class to use. And with that, Django will be able to create a form based on our definition here, but it then will also be able to automatically save data when that form is submitted in a valid state. And then it will redirect us to the success URL thereafter. So now we can get rid of form valid here and just have this code here to render a form, validate a form, show errors if needed, and save the data through that review model if the data is submitted successfully. So with all that, if we now save this updated view here, if I go back to localhost 8000 and I enter a new feedback, this should work. And I click send, I'm redirected here. And if we have a look at reviews, this indeed was stored successfully. So that's the create view, which is awesome if you have this scenario that data should be created. You want to present a form for that with all the features we implemented in the last course section, and the data should then be saved to a database. Now, besides the create view, we also have the update view and the delete view. I'll not dive into them here, but they work kind of in the same way. They basically focus on fetching data and then showing you a form pre-populated with that data and then updating that data in the database once the form is submitted in case of the update view. And the delete view, of course, is all about allowing you to delete data. These are more specialized views you could use, but I think we had a look at enough views for the moment, and you hopefully get the idea behind all these pre-built views and when you might want to use them. Now we're going to see some of these views in action in our course project, the blog, where we're also going to apply this. But before we do that, there are more core Django features I want to dive in together with you.